A plain brown package arrived at the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History on November 10th, 1958. Inside was a 45.5 2-carat blue diamond wrapped in tissue paper. The shipping cost was $145.29. Most of that was insurance. The stone had once belonged to a woman who owned two of Washington's grandest estates, threw parties for thousands, and let wounded soldiers try on her jewels. She buried two of her 4 children, watched her husband declared insane, and lived to see one mansion demolished and another sold to foreign diplomats. The diamond survived her. Everything else did not. This is the story of Evalyn Walsh McLean, the copper heiress whose father's gold built palaces in the capital, whose cursed diamond became more famous than her name, and whose life proved that survival and living are not the same thing. Before we dive into this story of gilded tragedy, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. And if you're fascinated by the intersection of extreme wealth and impossible loss, make sure to subscribe. You won't want to miss what comes next. Now, let's go back to where it all began. Leadville, Colorado, 1886. A miner's daughter was born in a town built on silver, in a family sustained by failure. Her father had been trying to strike it rich for 17 years, 17 years of moving between camps, 17 years of watching other men find gold while he found nothing, 17 years of telling his wife that next year would be different. Thomas Francis Walsh was born in Tipperary, Ireland in 1850. At 12, he apprenticed as a millwright, learning to build and repair the machinery that powered grain mills. The work taught him how mechanisms functioned, how force could be transferred through gears and levers, how proper engineering could multiply human effort. These lessons would serve him more later in mines where bad engineering killed men and good engineering made fortunes. At 19, he left Ireland with his sister, Maria. They arrived in America with little more than carpentry skills and ambition. The year was 1869. America was recovering from civil war. The Transcontinental Railroad had just been completed. The West was opening. Thomas found work building railroad trestles for the Colorado Central Railroad. The pay was steady. The work was brutal. Men fell from scaffolding. Wood crushed fingers. Winter froze everything. But Thomas saved money while others spent theirs on whiskey and cards. When the panic of 1873 hit and carpentry work dried up, he joined the gold rush like thousands of other men who believed the West held answers that the East had withheld. For years he moved between mining camps. Del Norte, where he worked, claims that produced nothing. Leadville, where silver made other men rich while he struggled. Central City, where he learned hard rock mining techniques. Kokomo, where winter lasted 8 months and supplies cost triple what they cost in Denver. Places where fortunes appeared overnight and vanished by morning. He lived in a boxcar, fitted with a stove and a cot. The boxcar could be moved when a claim failed. The boxcar was cheap. The boxcar was home. He ran a hotel in one camp that barely broke even. The hotel taught him about people, about who would pay their bills and who wouldn't, about which miners knew what they were doing and which were just guessing. He grub-staked prospectors, trading mining equipment for stakes in their claims, learning the business from men who had nothing to lose but worthless holes in the ground. Most of them lost everything. Walsh watched and learned. He studied the geology they ignored. He noted which claims failed because of bad luck and which failed because of bad judgment. He learned to read rock formations. He learned to identify promising ore by colour and texture. He learned which assayers were honest and which inflated results to keep miners working. Walsh took a methodical approach that other prospectors mocked. They called him slow. They called him careful, to the point of cowardice. While they drank their earnings at saloons that operated 24 hours a day, he studied mining technology at night by lamplight. He read engineering journals. He corresponded with geologists. He bought abandoned claims during downturns, betting that techniques would improve, or that previous miners had missed something valuable. Other men thought he was a fool buying worthless holes. They laughed when he paid real money for claims that had been worked and abandoned. Walsh believed in patience. Walsh believed that geology doesn't lie, but men do. In 1877 he arrived in Leadville with between $75,000 and $100,000 saved from carpentry and small mining ventures, enough to stop working for others, enough to make real bets. He was 27 years old. He had been in America for 8 years. He had nothing to show for it except money in a bank and knowledge in his head. He married Carrie Bell Reed, a former schoolteacher from Massachusetts who had followed her sister west. Carrie was educated in a way that was unusual for women of her generation, refined in a way that seemed absurd in mining camps. She had read Emerson and Thoreau. She believed in transcendentalism and the inherent goodness of nature. She married a miner who lived in a boxcar. Her family back east considered it a disaster. She considered it an adventure. They had 2 children. Evelyn, born August 1st, 1886. Vincent, born 2 years later in 1888. The family had little. A house in Leadville that creaked in winter when wind came down from the mountains. Enough to eat, not enough for much else. Carrie taught the children to read from books she'd brought from Massachusetts. Thomas kept searching. The silver crash of 1893 destroyed what modest success Walsh had built as a silver ore refiner. Congress repealed the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. Silver prices collapsed overnight. Mines that had operated for decades closed in weeks. Smelters shut down, laying off thousands. Entire towns emptied. Men who had been wealthy on Monday were broke by Friday. Walsh lost money. Not everything, but enough to hurt. Other men lost everything and went home to wives who barely recognized them, to children who had forgotten their faces. Walsh refused to quit. He had spent too many years learning geology to give up when markets failed. He shifted his focus to gold. By 1896, he was buying up abandoned claims in the Imogene Basin above Ouray, Colorado. The basin sat at over 11,000 feet, accessible only by narrow trails that washed out in summer and froze in winter. Most miners had written off the area. The previous owners had extracted what they could and moved on to easier prospects. The conventional wisdom was that the basin was worked out. Walsh saw opportunity in the geology others ignored. He noticed rock formations that suggested mineralization. He saw evidence of fault lines that previous miners had missed. He bought claim after claim at prices that made brokers laugh. In July 1896, he was examining one of his newly acquired claims, the Hidden Treasure Mine, when he sampled reddish rock that looked promising. The colour suggested iron oxide. Iron oxide often appeared near gold deposits. He took samples to an assayer. He trusted in Ouray. The results came back rich in gold, silver, lead, and copper. Very rich. Walsh kept the discovery secret for months. He told no one, not his wife, not his partners, no one. He quietly bought more properties in the basin before anyone could ask questions or prices could rise. He accumulated 16 claims. covering the most promising geology in the basin. When he finally opened the mine publicly, he named it Campbird after the camp robber jays, grey ravens that stole food from miners working the site. The Campbird mine began producing $5,000 a day in ore. $5,000 a day when most mines produced $5,000 a month if they were lucky. Adjusted for inflation, that equals roughly $150,000 to $190,000 daily in today's money. The mine sat at 11,600 feet, high enough that snow buried equipment 8 months of the year, high enough that men got altitude sickness working shifts, high enough that horses couldn't work, so everything had to be done by hand or by machinery. Walsh engineered a gravity-powered aerial tramway system to transport ore down the mountain to the mill at Sneffels, 3 miles away and 3,000 feet lower. The tramway was a marvel of engineering. Buckets carrying 800 pounds of ore each travelled on cables suspended between towers. Gravity pulled loaded buckets down while pulling empty buckets back up. The system operated in weather that would have stopped conventional mining. The tramway reduced transportation costs so dramatically that ore that wouldn't have been profitable to mine suddenly was. Walsh's carpentry and engineering knowledge from his youth paid off in ways he never could have predicted. He built boarding facilities near the mine entrance so workers wouldn't lose hours hiking up and down the mountain each day. The boarding house had steam heat, electric lights powered by a generator, hot water, clean beds, and food that didn't come from cans. Other mine owners built shacks. Walsh built infrastructure. Walsh came home one day in 1897 and found his daughter playing in the yard of their Leadville house. She was 11 years old. She had known nothing but modest circumstances her entire life. Her father looked at her and uttered the words she would later use as the title of her memoir. "Daughter, I've struck it rich." He had. He absolutely had. In the first 4 years of operation, the mine produced $2.5 million in gold, silver, lead, and copper. Production costs were only $885,000. Walsh cleared about $1.65 million in profit, more money than most men saw in 10 lifetimes. But he didn't operate like other mine owners who extracted everything and paid workers nothing. He paid wages that drew the best workers from competing operations all over Colorado. Men heard about Campbird and quit other jobs to work there. He implemented 8-hour workdays when most mines worked men 12 hours in darkness with candles or headlamps that failed regularly. He built a 3-story boarding house for up to 400 miners with electric lights, steam heat, modern plumbing, hot showers that men could take after shifts, and a reading room stocked with newspapers and books. The reading room was mocked by other owners. Why would miners need books? Walsh believed men worked better when treated like human beings rather than machinery. Other mines in the region descended into violent labor unrest during this period. Strikes shut down operations, dynamite destroyed equipment, armed guards shot striking workers. The Colorado labor wars killed dozens. Campbird stayed peaceful. The men knew they had the best deal in Colorado. They knew Walsh treated them fairly. They knew their families were housed and fed. Walsh's investment in dignity paid off in productivity and loyalty. While other mines spent money on guards and replacement workers, Walsh spent money on equipment and efficiency improvements. When 1902 arrived, Thomas Walsh made a decision that would define his family's future. He sold the Campbird to a British syndicate called the Campbird Limited for $5.2 million. Between the profits during his 6 years of ownership and the sale price, he retired as one of the wealthiest men in America. The mine would continue producing for nearly a century under various owners, ultimately yielding about 1.5 million troy ounces of gold and 4 million troy ounces of silver, worth over $1.5 billion at 2009 prices when finally calculated. Walsh had found what other men had walked past. The question was no longer how to find gold. The question was what to do with more money than most men could imagine. 1898 brought the Walsh family to Washington. Thomas wanted roots in the capital, not in mining camps where everything was temporary and nothing lasted. He wanted his children educated in proper schools. He wanted his wife to have the life she deserved after years in mining camps. He purchased a house at 1825, Phelps Place. The location gave him proximity to power. The house was respectable, solid. It announced that the Walsh family had arrived. He met presidents through business, connections and political donations. He entertained politicians and diplomats at dinners where Carrie presided with the confidence of an educated woman who had read more than most of the men in attendance. He presented himself as the Colorado Monte Cristo, an immigrant who had conquered the American West through hard work and calculated risk. The newspapers loved the story. Irish immigrant makes millions, builds mansion, joins society. It was the American dream compressed into headlines that sold papers. His daughter Evelyn, now 12 years old and suddenly wealthy, found the transition jarring. She had been a tomboy in Colorado mining towns where she climbed slag heaps and played with miners' children who taught her to swear in 5 languages. She had worn boys' clothes because dresses got caught on rocks. She had learned to ride horses bareback because saddles cost money they didn't have. Now, her father expected her to become a lady. Now she was supposed to wear dresses and learn French and practice piano and drink tea with girls who had never been more than 10 miles from Washington. She had little formal schooling because the family had moved too often. She had no interest in etiquette or refinement. She couldn't see the point of learning which fork to use when you were just going to eat the food anyway. The Walshes sailed frequently to Europe on steamships where first-class passengers changed clothes 4 times a day and complained about service that was better than anything most people experienced on land. On one trip, her parents placed her in a convent school in Paris run by nuns who specialized in reforming wealthy American girls who had no discipline. The nuns tried. They really tried. Evelyn was polite to them. She attended their classes. She simply ignored everything they taught her. She nodded and smiled and did exactly what she wanted. Her parents retrieved her after 3 months when it became clear the convent was accomplishing nothing except costing them money. Thomas Walsh decided to build something permanent, something that would announce to Washington society that the Walsh family belonged at the highest levels. On April 30th, 1901, he purchased land at 2020 Massachusetts Avenue in the fashionable DuPont Circle neighborhood. The location was perfect. Massachusetts Avenue was becoming Embassy Row. The wealthiest families in America were building mansions along its length. The Blaine Mansion was there, the Boardman House, Patterson House. Walsh wanted a house that would equal or surpass them all. He hired Henry Anderson, a Danish-born architect working in New York, to design a mansion that would announce the Walsh family's arrival in Washington society. Not merely wealth, not merely success, legitimacy. Anderson had trained in Europe and understood what old money looked like. He understood that new money had to work harder to achieve the same effect. Walsh gave him a budget that made Anderson's eyes widen. Build something that will last forever. Build something that looks like it's been here forever. build something that my grandchildren will be proud of. Construction began in 1901. The project took 2 years and cost between $835,000 and $853,000, approximately $20 million in today's currency, though comparisons across a century are imperfect. Newspapers reported it would be the most expensive private house ever constructed in the nation's capital. The articles included architectural drawings, commentary about the Irish immigrant who was building a palace. Some of the commentary was admiring, some was resentful. Walsh didn't care. He had spent years being poor. He was done with that. Anderson designed every detail to convey permanence and taste. The completed mansion was eclectic in a way that only enormous budgets allow. He combined Renaissance, Baroque, Louis XVI, and Art Nouveau elements into a facade that defied easy classification but suggested European sophistication and old-world culture. The base was rusticated granite blocks that looked like they had stood for centuries. Each block was cut and fitted by stonemasons who had learned their trade in Europe. A blind limestone balustrade capped the roofline, creating the illusion that the mansion had multiple terraces even where it didn't. The structure rose 4 stories and contained 60 rooms. 60 rooms for a family of 4 plus servants. Inside, Thomas Walsh requested specific features that mattered to him. He wanted a staircase that resembled those found on ocean liners, grand, sweeping, engineered for spectacle. He had crossed the Atlantic multiple times by then. He had seen how European aristocrats descended staircases at formal dinners. He wanted that in his home. He wanted the entry hall to announce arrival in a way that made guests understand they were somewhere important. He wanted salons where he could host cabinet members and foreign dignitaries without anyone questioning whether an Irish immigrant belonged in such company. The mansion included a ballroom that could accommodate 200 guests for dancing, a library with floor-to-ceiling shelves that Walsh filled with books he intended to read someday, a conservatory with glass walls where Carrie could grow plants that had no business surviving Washington winters, bedrooms sized for royalty with en-suite bathrooms that had hot, running water, still a luxury in 1903. The mechanical systems were state-of-the-art, electric lighting throughout powered by a generator in the basement, central heating with radiators in every room. Modern plumbing that didn't freeze in winter, a constant problem in Washington houses built earlier. The kitchen was enormous, designed to produce meals for hundreds when the Walshes entertained. It had multiple stoves, cold storage, a separate room for washing dishes and quarters for kitchen staff. The service areas were as well appointed as many families' entire houses. Walsh believed that people who worked for you deserved decent conditions. This philosophy had worked in the mines. It worked in his house. Later, after Walsh died, the leading New York interior designer Elsie de Wolfe would handle redecoration when fashions changed and the original interiors looked dated. De Wolfe would lighten everything, remove heavy Victorian drapes, replace dark wood with lighter finishes, make the mansion feel less like a European palace and more like an American one. But the bones were Walsh's vision. The structure was his monument. The Walshes moved in during the fall of 1903. They referred to the house simply as 2020, the street address serving as both location and identity. Thomas Walsh had built his stage. The mansion functioned as intended. It established the Walshes as a force in Washington society. King Albert of Belgium stayed there during a United States visit in 1919, sleeping in a bedroom prepared specifically for visiting royalty. Presidents McKinley, Theodore Roosevelt, and Taft visited for dinners where policy was discussed between courses, and after, when the men retired to the library for brandy and cigars. Senators and Supreme Court justices attended receptions where Carrie Walsh presided with the confidence of someone who knew she belonged, despite having started her married life in a mining camp. The Colorado prospector had become a Washington institution within 5 years. He had bought his way in with gold. He had stayed in through charm and strategic generosity. His daughter would be the star of the next generation. Evalyn Walsh had no intention of being a lady. At 14, her father sent her to Paris for singing lessons, hoping European culture would refine her. The plan seemed sound. Paris had refined countless American girls whose parents could afford it. His bankers provided her with a $10,000 letter of credit, expecting she would use it for music instruction, and appropriate clothing suitable for a young woman of her station. She bought a sports car instead, a gleaming French automobile that went faster than anything she had driven before. The machine was dangerous, the machine was thrilling, the machine was exactly what she wanted. She lived what she later described in her memoir as a wild life. She coloured her hair in shades that made chaperones gasp. She added rouge to her cheeks in quantities that shocked other Americans who saw her. She drank alcohol at cafes where Americans gathered to escape American rules and American judgment. She smoked cigarettes in public, which was considered scandalous for women in 1901. She ignored the singing lessons entirely. Her voice teacher wrote letters to her parents explaining that Evelyn had talent, but refused to practice. The letters went unanswered because Carrie and Thomas had no idea what to do with their daughter. Her parents tried various strategies to control her. They hired chaperones who were supposed to watch her constantly. Evelyn eluded them. They imposed curfews. Evelyn ignored them. They threatened to cut her allowance. Evelyn called their bluff, and they backed down. She learned to walk like Parisian women with a hip-forward stride that suggested confidence bordering on arrogance. She learned French from shopgirls and waiters. She licked Baedeker's guidebook covers to make her lips red when she didn't have rouge with her. She swore in French she would not become the refined socialite her father envisioned. She would become something else, something more interesting, something that didn't require her to pretend she cared about things she didn't. 1905 brought tragedy that reshaped everything and ended Evelyn's European adventure. The Walsh family was spending summer in a rented house in Newport, Rhode Island, where wealthy families gathered to escape Washington heat and compete over who could throw the most extravagant parties. Evelyn's 17-year-old brother Vincent was driving an electric car, one of the new machines that were supposed to be safer than gasoline automobiles because they couldn't explode. He was driving too fast. Everyone agreed on that later. He lost control on a turn. The vehicle crashed into a stone wall with enough force to crumple the frame. Vincent died at the scene. His neck was broken. Evelyn was also in the car. She was sitting next to her brother when he lost control. Her leg was crushed between the seat and the collapsing frame, badly set by the first doctors who treated her because they didn't realize the extent of the damage. The bones healed wrong. The injury shortened her right leg by 1.5 inches. She would walk with a slight limp for the rest of her life, a permanent reminder of the day her brother died. She underwent a dangerous operation months later to re-break and reset the bones. The procedure required morphine for pain management, days of it, then weeks. The pain was extraordinary. The morphine made it bearable. Then the morphine became necessary for reasons that had nothing to do with pain. She developed an addiction to the drug that terrified her parents and terrified her. Morphine was legal. Doctors prescribed it freely to anyone who could pay. But Evelyn recognized what was happening to her. She saw herself needing the drug, craving it, organizing her day around when she could take more. Later, through what she described as sheer willpower, aided by her mother's constant supervision, she would cure herself. She went through withdrawal in her bedroom at 2020, while Carrie sat with her and held her hand through the worst of it. But the experience left permanent marks, physical and psychological. She had survived what killed her brother. She had been in the same car, sitting next to him, and she lived while he died. The guilt and relief were equally unbearable. The relief made her feel guilty. The guilt made her feel like she didn't deserve to feel relief. She spent years untangling those feelings. Around this time, as she was recovering from the operation and the addiction, Evelyn met Edward Beale McLean. Everyone called him Ned. He was the only child of John Roll McLean, owner of the Washington Post and the Cincinnati Enquirer. John McLean had built a newspaper empire that gave him influence over politics, business, and society throughout the capital and the Midwest. The town of McLean, Virginia, had been named after his grandfather. The family had wealth that stretched back generations. Ned's mother was Emily Truxton Beale, a prominent socialite who had inspired a character in Henry Adams's novel Democracy, the calculating, ambitious Mrs. Lee who manipulated Washington society for entertainment. The Beale family fortune came from land grants and political connections that stretched back to the Revolutionary War. When California had been taken from Mexico, the Beales had been there acquiring land. When railroads had been built, the Beales had been there acquiring right-of-way. The McLean fortune came from newspapers and real estate. Combined, they made Ned one of the wealthiest young men in America. Ned had been raised in extraordinary wealth without discipline or consequences. According to family law that Alice Roosevelt later repeated at dinner parties, his parents had bribed childhood friends to let him win at games because they couldn't bear to see him cry when he lost. They had paid other children's parents. The friends would let Ned win at tennis or chess or cards, then collect their payment later. Ned grew up believing he was naturally talented at everything. He grew into a man Alice Roosevelt later described as having no chin and no character. The chin comment was literal. Ned had a weak jaw. The character comment was metaphorical and accurate. He drank heavily from a young age, bourbon mostly. He started at breakfast with bourbon in his coffee. By noon he was drinking it straight. By dinner, he was drunk. He spent recklessly on horses and automobiles and anything that caught his attention for more than 5 minutes. He bought a thoroughbred racehorse for $50,000 because he liked its name. The horse never won a race. Evelyn wrote in her memoir that he was so changeable that at times I felt quite polyandrous, implying that being married to Ned was like being married to multiple different men because his personality shifted with his moods and his drinking. She meant it as a joke when she wrote it. It was also accurate. The Walsh parents opposed the marriage. Thomas could see that Ned had no sense of responsibility. Carrie could see that Ned would make her daughter miserable. They argued with Evelyn. They presented evidence of his character. They forbade her from seeing him. So did the McLean parents, who thought Evelyn was beneath their son despite her father's fortune. Neither young person had demonstrated maturity or financial restraint. Evelyn was 19 and had just recovered from morphine addiction. Ned was 23 and showed no signs he would ever grow up or take anything seriously. Both families tried to stop what seemed inevitable. Evelyn and Ned eloped on July 22, 1908. They married in a private ceremony that excluded both sets of parents. Both sets of parents reconciled themselves to the situation within weeks, because what else could they do? The marriage had happened. Annulment would create scandal. Divorce was unthinkable for families at their social level. They gave the newlyweds generous cash gifts totaling $200,000, $100,000 from each family. The money was meant to help them establish a household. The money was meant to encourage them to settle down and start behaving like adults. The couple spent it immediately on an extravagant honeymoon around the world. The newlyweds sailed for Europe with $200,000 in cash, gifts from parents who hoped money might stabilize them. It had the opposite effect. Money removed consequences. Money meant they could do whatever they wanted without ever having to worry about whether they could afford it. In Paris, the impetuous couple visited the Cartier store at 13 Rue de Paix. Evelyn had shopped there with her father when he wanted to buy Carrie jewelry that matched their new status as Washington millionaires. She knew the store. She knew the brothers who ran it. The store was run by three brothers, Pierre, Jacques, and Louis Cartier, who understood that selling to Americans required theatre as much as gemology. Americans wanted stories with their jewelry. They wanted history. They wanted provenance. The Cartier provided all of that, some of it accurate and some of it invented, in service of making sales that ran into hundreds of thousands of dollars. Ned and Evelyn were captivated by a 94.8 carat pear-shaped diamond called the Star of the East. The stone caught light in ways that seemed impossible. It glowed. It blazed. It made everything else in the store look dull. The price was $120,000. Neither hesitated. Evelyn remembered gasping, "Ned, it's got me. I'll never get away from the spell of this." She wasn't exaggerating. She felt the stone pulling at her, demanding to be owned. They signed a receipt and walked out with it. Evelyn wore it immediately, describing herself as half-drunk with excitement. She felt transformed wearing it. She felt powerful. She smuggled it back into the United States, tucked in her clothing, to avoid paying customs fees that would have run into tens of thousands of dollars. The thrill of getting away with it was almost as intoxicating as owning the diamond itself. She wore it to parties in Washington. Photographers captured her wearing it. The Star of the East became famous, but it would be overshadowed by what came next. Thomas Walsh died on April 8, 1910. A heart attack took him suddenly while he was working in his office at 2020. One moment he was reviewing business papers. The next moment he was gone. 60 years old, too young to die. But the strain of building an empire and maintaining it had taken its toll. His daughter inherited the 2020 mansion and a substantial fortune. She was 23 years old, married to an alcoholic who showed no signs of ever growing up, and possessed of a diamond collection that was about to grow even larger. In 1910, the McLeans returned to Paris. Pierre Cartier arrived at their hotel during breakfast with another diamond. He didn't show it to them immediately. He kept it hidden in a sealed package while he told elaborate stories about its history. The diamond had supposedly passed through the court of Versailles during the reign of Louis XVI. It had belonged to Marie Antoinette, who wore it at parties before the revolution came and took her head. It had passed through the Sultan's harem in Turkey, where it was worn by a wife who was later stabbed to death when the Sultan went mad. It had been owned by various European aristocrats, many of whom had died violently, gone insane, or lost their fortunes shortly after acquiring the stone. Marie Antoinette had owned it before her head was separated from her body during the French Revolution. So had Louis XVI before the guillotine found him. A Turkish sultan named Abdul Hamid had supposedly owned it, and then stabbed one of his wives to death while she was wearing it, though this story was almost certainly invented by Cartier. The diamond was cursed, Pierre explained with theatrical gravity. It brought bad luck to everyone who touched it. Death, madness, financial ruin. He had a list of owners and their fates. Most of the list was fiction, some of it was real. Pierre didn't care which was which. He was selling a story. Evelyn dismissed the curse immediately. "Bad luck objects for me are lucky," she stated flatly. Her father had just died. Her brother had been killed in a car accident 5 years earlier. She had survived the same crash that took him, losing part of her mobility in the process. She had become addicted to morphine and cured herself through force of will. She felt she had nothing left to fear. What could a diamond do that life hadn't already done to her? What curse could possibly be worse than what she had already experienced? But she didn't like the setting Cartier showed her. The stone was mounted in an old-fashioned heavy setting that looked like something from a museum rather than something you could actually wear. It was jewelry for display, not for wearing to parties. She rejected the purchase on aesthetic grounds. The curse didn't scare her. The ugly setting did. Pierre Cartier was persistent. He understood he was selling more than a diamond. He was selling a story. He was selling the idea of owning something that kings and queens had owned. He was selling immortality through possession. He had the stone reset by his best craftsman and shipped it to the United States. He sailed after it on the Lusitania, the fastest passenger liner crossing the Atlantic. He wrote to the McLeans suggesting a second appointment now that the setting had been improved. When they met again at the McLean residence in Washington, the setting had been changed completely. The blue diamond now rested in a smaller diamond cluster suspended from a diamond chain. The new setting made the stone wearable. It became jewelry rather than just a museum curiosity. You could put it on. You could go to parties wearing it. Evelyn still wasn't convinced she wanted to spend $180,000 on a piece of jewelry, even if she had spent $120,000 on the Star of the East without blinking. Pierre pressed her to keep it for a few days to think about it. He left it at their house. It was a sales tactic. Let the customer live with the object. Let them get used to having it. Let them imagine not having it anymore. Evelyn placed it on her dresser, where morning light hit it through the window. The stone's magic began working on her. She couldn't stop looking at it. She would wake up and immediately look for the blue glow. She would walk past it during the day and stop to stare. The stone had presence. It commanded attention in a way that ordinary jewelry didn't. Evelyn decided she wanted the stone blessed before purchasing it. She couldn't shake Pierre's curse stories entirely, even though she claimed not to believe them. Superstition is hard to kill, especially when you're about to spend the modern equivalent of $5 million on something that supposedly brings death to its owners. She arranged for Monsignor Russell, a prominent Catholic priest in Washington, to bless it in a church. She wanted the blessing to happen formally, with full ceremony, so the curse, if it existed, would know it was being opposed. The diamond was placed on a velvet cushion at the altar. Monsignor Russell stood over it in his vestments, ready to perform the blessing. As he was about to begin speaking the Latin words, lightning flashed outside the church windows despite there being no storm. Thunder shook the building's foundation with enough force that several people in attendance gasped. There was no wind or rain, just darkness that suddenly appeared, and lurid lightning thrusts that made the stained glass windows glow in strange colours. Then it passed as quickly as it had come. Evelyn took it as a sign of good luck, rather than bad luck. Everyone else in the church thought it was a warning. Evelyn thought it meant the curse and the blessing were fighting it out, and the blessing had won. she decided to buy the diamond. The curse could do its worst. She had already survived the worst that life could throw at her. Or so she thought. On January 28th, 1911, in a deal made in the offices of the Washington Post, where Ned's family controlled everything, Ned McLean purchased what would forever be known as the Hope Diamond for $180,000 from Pierre Cartier. The stone was a Type 2B diamond, a rare classification, semi-conductive and phosphorescent, glowing an eerie red after exposure to ultraviolet light. Its blue coloration came from trace amounts of boron embedded in the crystal structure during formation deep underground millions of years ago. It was one of the rarest and most valuable diamonds in the world. From that day forward, Evelyn and the stone became almost inseparable. She wore it constantly, to parties at Friendship, to dinners at 2020, to the theatre, to horse races, to casual lunches. Photographers captured her wearing it at every opportunity. It became her emblem more than the Star of the East ever had. The blue diamond became associated with Evalyn Walsh, McLean in the same way that certain jewels become associated with queens. Press coverage began calling it the Hope Diamond after Henry Philip Hope, an English banking heir who had owned it decades earlier. The name stuck. The curse, if it existed, would have to wait. Friendship had become the centre of the McLean's world years before the diamond arrived. The estate, 75 acres along Wisconsin Avenue in what was then rural Washington, far north of the developed city, represented everything the McLean family fortune could buy and everything money couldn't. The original structure, called Eden Bower, had been built around 1800 by British Colonel Richard Pyle as a country retreat. Georgetown University later purchased the property and used it as a retreat for faculty, calling it College Villa. The location offered views of the Potomac Valley and had enough land for farming and recreation. In 1898, Ned's father, John R. McLean, and his wife Emily purchased the house and the land and began extensive improvements that would transform a country house into an estate worthy of newspaper royalty. John McLean had money and ambition, but no taste, so he hired the best. He commissioned the architect John Russell Pope, the man who would later design the Jefferson Memorial and the National Gallery of Art and other monuments that would define Washington's appearance, to expand the property into a Georgian Revival manor house. Pope was at the beginning of his career in the 1890s, eager to prove himself with wealthy clients who could afford to let him experiment. Pope transformed the modest country house into something that looked like it had been transplanted from Virginia plantation country. White columns that rose 2 stories, symmetrical wings that created perfect proportions, red brick facade that suggested old money, even though the McLean money was newspaper fresh. He added a porte cochere where carriages and later automobiles could deliver guests out of the weather. The house expanded to over 30 rooms, each designed for specific purposes. The estate included an 18-hole golf course maintained by a staff of 6 groundskeepers who worked full-time to keep it playable, a cast-iron swimming pool that required constant heating to be usable more than 3 months a year, tennis courts with clay surfaces imported from Europe that played faster than American clay, stables that housed thoroughbred horses Ned raced at nearby tracks in Maryland, Italian gardens with statuary and fountains that cost more than most people's houses, filled with plants that shouldn't have survived Washington winters but did, because money paid for greenhouses and gardeners who knew what they were doing. In 1916, ownership of the estate transferred from John R. McLean to Edward and Evelyn McLean. The transfer was partly because John's mental health was failing, and partly because Ned had proven he could manage the property. Even if he couldn't manage anything else in his life, the estate became theirs to use and destroy as they saw fit. They chose to use it for parties that would become legendary. The couple transformed friendship into Washington's social epicenter during the 1910s and 1920s. They entertained thousands at a time. Not hundreds, thousands. Literally thousands of guests would attend parties that lasted all night and into the next day. The guest lists included diplomats from every embassy in Washington, dignitaries visiting from Europe, royalty traveling incognito, national leaders who were supposed to be running the country, scholars from Georgetown and American University, entertainers passing through Washington on their way to New York, journalists who covered Washington society, and anyone interesting who happened to be in the capital and could get an invitation. Presidents Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge played golf on the estate's 18-hole course. Regularly. Harding was a particular regular who used the visits to escape the White House and drink bourbon that Evelyn served, despite prohibition making alcohol illegal after 1920. Evelyn ignored prohibition. Most wealthy people did. The law was for other people. Mrs. Coolidge would knit on the front porch while her husband played 18 holes, her needles clicking in rhythm with the cicadas that emerged every 17 years. Alice Roosevelt Longworth, daughter of Theodore Roosevelt and one of the most acerbic and witty women in Washington, became one of Evelyn's closest friends, despite coming from Republican political royalty, while the McLeans were Democrat adjacent. Alice was known for saying, "If you can't say something nice about someone, sit right here by me." The remark captured the irreverent spirit that characterized the friendship circle. Politics was discussed frankly. Reputations were destroyed casually. Affairs were conducted in guest bedrooms while parties continued downstairs. Evelyn presided over it all, wearing the blue diamond around her neck, the curse seemingly forgotten. The McLeans kept exotic animals on the grounds because why not? They purchased a white llama from the Ringling Brothers Circus that roamed freely across the extensive lawns, occasionally spitting at guests who got too close or tried to pet it without permission. There were peacocks that screamed at dawn and destroyed gardens, dogs of various breeds, horses in the stables, everything except restraint. The estate reportedly had the highest private electric bill in the capital because every room blazed with electric light all night. The parties never really ended. Someone was always awake. Something was always happening. Evelyn's parties became legendary for their excess, even in an era known for excess. She once threw a birthday party for her poodle that cost over $1 million in 1920s money. The dog wore the Hope Diamond on its collar during the celebration, while guests who included senators and Supreme Court justices laughed, and photographers captured the absurdity for newspapers that would print the photos on front pages. The party included an orchestra, a catered dinner for hundreds of guests, and entertainment that lasted until dawn for a dog's birthday. Security was intense, especially for the children. Evelyn had given birth to her first child on December 18, 1909, about a year after her marriage to Ned. She named him Vincent Walsh McLean, after her dead brother, whose death still haunted her years later. The press immediately dubbed the infant the $100 million baby, calculating the combined fortunes of the Walsh and McLean families and assuming the child would inherit everything. The McLeans were terrified of kidnappers. The Lindbergh kidnapping wouldn't happen until 1932, but wealthy families already feared having their children stolen for ransom. They hired bodyguards to watch the children constantly. They provided young Vincent with a companion, a scrubbed, perfumed young boy from a working-class family who was paid to play with Vincent under supervision, to prevent him from being spoiled by wealth and to ensure he always had company that could be monitored. Every precaution was taken to ensure the children's safety. Every possible threat was anticipated. Every contingency was planned for. None of it would matter. Ned McLean's life followed its own trajectory, separate from the children and separate from Evelyn's social triumphs. In 1916, the same year, he gained control of Friendship. He gained control of the Washington Post after his father appeared to grow mentally unstable. John R. McLean had become erratic and paranoid, seeing conspiracies everywhere, making bizarre business decisions that threatened the newspaper's survival. A court quietly declared him incapable of managing his affairs. Ned inherited control of the newspaper at age 31. Ownership of the Post placed the McLeans inside Washington's upper echelons of power brokers. Ned could influence elections through editorial decisions and news coverage. He could destroy reputations with negative stories or save them with positive coverage or silence. He could make or break politicians depending on how the Post covered them. This power should have made him formidable. Instead, it made him dangerous because he had no judgment about how to use it. Ned also owned and raced thoroughbred horses at tracks in Maryland and Virginia, losing more money than he won, but enjoying the prestige of being an owner. He drank heavily throughout the day, starting with bourbon in his morning coffee, continuing through lunch and ending with champagne at dinner parties, where he would often pass out before dessert was served. His spending was as reckless as Evelyn's. Their parents had given them a monthly allowance of $1,000 each to encourage financial discipline after the honeymoon spending spree. It never lasted 30 days. Usually it was gone in a week or less. Ned would buy another horse on impulse. Evelyn would buy jewellery because she was bored. Neither saw any reason to stop spending. For 8 years after the diamond purchase, no tragedy befell the McLeans. 8 years where the cursed narrative remained dormant. 8 years where life at Friendship continued its extravagant rhythm. Parties every weekend, golf with presidents, horses racing, newspapers printing, children growing. Everything seemed fine. Everything seemed stable. Then, in the spring of 1918, everything changed in the single moment that proved security means nothing against random chance. May 18th, 1918, a Saturday afternoon, 9-year-old Vincent Walsh McLean was playing near the front of the Friendship estate with his companion. Despite the bodyguards who were paid to watch him constantly, despite the careful supervision that had been maintained since his birth, the boy playfully eluded his guard. He was 9. He wanted to feel free for a moment. He caught sight of an acquaintance, another child from a neighboring estate, across Wisconsin Avenue. He ran into the street without looking. A Ford automobile traveling at moderate speed struck him. The driver had no time to react. 8 hours later at Georgetown Hospital, young Vincent died from his injuries. Ned and Evelyn were in Cincinnati on business related to the Enquirer when the accident happened. They received a telegram and raced back to Washington by train, but there was nothing to be done by the time they arrived. The extraordinary security measures, the careful planning, the millions spent on protection, none of it had prevented a 9-year-old boy from making the decision that killed him. The press coverage was brutal because the press loved stories about how money couldn't save you. One headline read, "The poor little rich boy killed by kindness. How the extraordinary painstaking care to safeguard. Little Vincent McLean, the $100 million baby, from any possible misfortune led to the child's tragic death. The article argued that the security had created a false sense of safety that made Vincent careless, that if he had been raised normally, he would have known to look before crossing streets, that the bodyguards had made him believe nothing could hurt him. The article was cruel. The article was probably correct. The irony was unavoidable to everyone who read it. Vincent Walsh McLean had been named after his uncle, who had also died in a car accident at age 17. Both Vincents, both automobiles. The pattern seemed impossible to ignore. The curse of the Hope Diamond had been a story Pierre Cartier told to sell jewellery. Now it seemed real to everyone watching the McLeans. Ned's mother, Emily Truxton Beale McLean, had died of pneumonia in Bar Harbour, Maine, in 1912, just 1 year after Evelyn purchased the stone. The death had been sudden. Emily had been healthy 1 week and dead the next. Friends and family had urged Evelyn to sell the stone back to Cartier after Emily's death. Sell it before something else happens. Get rid of it while you can. Cartier refused to buy it when she inquired. The market for cursed diamonds was limited, he explained, with the same theatrical flair he had used to sell it. Nobody wants a stone that brings death. Evelyn wore it anyway, convinced that bad luck objects for me are lucky. She had survived worse than the diamond could do. After young Vincent's death, the pressure intensified. Priests visited Friendship to urge her to donate the stone to a church, where it could be locked away and never worn. Family members pleaded with her to sell it or throw it in the Potomac River. Friends stopped visiting because they didn't want to be near the cursed object. Evelyn refused every suggestion. She had the stone. Selling it wouldn't bring her son back. Throwing it away wouldn't undo what had happened. She would keep it and wear it and dare the curse to do its worst. The McLeans buried their eldest son in Rock Creek Cemetery in a plot that would eventually hold other family members. 3 other children remained alive: John Randolph, Edward Beale Jr., and Emily Beale, who would later change her name to Evelyn Washington and go by Evie to honour her mother. The parties at Friendship continued after a brief period of mourning. The newspaper continued printing. The horses continued racing. Ned continued drinking. But something fundamental had shifted. Evelyn wore the diamond more frequently, not less, as if daring the curse to come for her next, as if challenging fate to take anything else from her. While Evelyn mourned her son and wore her curse, Ned's behaviour was becoming increasingly erratic even by his own standards. The drinking intensified beyond what anyone thought possible. Bourbon for breakfast became 2 bourbons. Whiskey by noon became a bottle. Champagne at dinner became champagne all evening until he passed out. He had affairs that everyone knew about, including Evelyn. His spending became reckless, even by McLean standards. Then came Teapot Dome, the scandal that would destroy what remained of his reputation and prove that he was exactly as weak as Alice Roosevelt had said. The scandal erupted in the early 1920s when it was revealed that Secretary of the Interior Albert B. Fall had accepted bribes to lease federal oil reserves at Teapot Dome in Wyoming and Elk Hills in California to private oil companies without competitive bidding. Fall was a close personal friend of Ned McLean. They drank together almost daily. They gambled together on horse races. They visited each other's homes. When investigating Senator Thomas J. Walsh, no relation to Evelyn's family, though the shared name created confusion, began asking questions about where Fall had gotten money for improvements to his New Mexico ranch, Ned testified falsely that he had given Fall a $100,000 loan. The lie was meant to provide Fall with a legitimate explanation for his sudden wealth. The truth was that Fall had illegally received $385,000 in bribes from oil tycoons Harry F. Sinclair and Edward L. Doheny in exchange for favourable leases. Senator Walsh, who was conducting the investigation with the thoroughness of a prosecutor, threatened to charge Ned with perjury if he didn't tell the truth. Ned admitted the falsity in testimony that newspapers gleefully reprinted on front pages across the country. His admission was later characterized by historians as the first climactic sensation and the smoking gun of the Teapot Dome scandal, because it proved Fall was lying about where his money came from. Ned had tried to help a friend and instead became evidence of corruption. His reputation was permanently destroyed. The Washington Post, which had defended him editorially and downplayed his role, became a laughingstock. Nobody took the paper seriously anymore. Circulation dropped. Advertisers pulled out. The newspaper that had been John R. McLean's pride was becoming worthless under Ned's leadership. The marriage was dissolving along with everything else. In 1928, after years of infidelity on both sides and drinking on Ned's side, the couple separated. Evelyn filed for divorce in October 1931 on grounds of infidelity, cruelty, and abandonment. Ned countered by filing for divorce in Mexico, where laws were more favourable to wealthy men who wanted quick divorces without having to prove grounds. Evelyn obtained an injunction from a District of Columbia court ordering the cessation of the Mexican proceedings. The legal battle dragged on through 1932. In what one observer described as a moment of wild humour, Ned sent Evelyn a Latvian divorce summons done up in a Christmas box, decorated with tiny reindeer and holly. On December 13th, 1932, Latvia, a country neither of them had ever visited, granted the divorce based on paperwork that may or may not have been legitimate. The proceedings continued in United States courts because nobody was sure whether a Latvian divorce was valid, but they became moot when a Maryland jury delivered its verdict. October 31st, 1933. Halloween. The jury declared Edward McLean legally insane and incapable of managing his affairs or making decisions about his own life. The court ordered him committed indefinitely to a psychiatric hospital. He was sent to Shepherd and Enoch Pratt Hospital in Towson, Maryland, an institution where wealthy families sent relatives who had become embarrassments too large to hide at home. Meanwhile, Ned's increasingly erratic behaviour and reckless spending had led to financial collapse of the newspaper empire his father and grandfather had built. The Washington Post was bleeding money. Court-appointed trustees forced the sale of the newspaper in 1933. Eugene Meyer, great-grandfather of Jeff Bezos, the current owner, bought it at a bankruptcy sale for $825,000, a fraction of what it had once been worth. Ned would spend the remaining 8 years of his life in that institution, slowly deteriorating, while the world outside moved on without him. Evelyn was alone at the Friendship estate with 3 surviving children and a diamond that wouldn't let her go. She had outlived her first son. She had outlived her marriage. But she refused to retreat from public life or pretend that she was defeated. Through the 1930s and into the war years of the 1940s, Evelyn maintained 2 completely different lives, one public, defiant, generous, visible to everyone in Washington, one private, collapsing slowly in ways only her closest friends could see. In 1932, her mother, Carrie Bell Reed Walsh, died of natural causes at age 78. Evelyn inherited the 2020 Massachusetts Avenue mansion, but she left it vacant. She continued living at Friendship, which held fewer memories of her mother. The mansion on Massachusetts Avenue sat empty for years. while Evelyn tried to figure out what to do with a 60-room house she didn't want to live in. Beginning in 1935, she made the practical decision to lease the mansion to the federal government, which needed office space for New Deal programs that were expanding rapidly. The Suburban Resettlement Administration used it in 1936 for offices related to relocating poor farmers from exhausted land to new communities with better soil. The Rural Electrification Commission occupied it in 1937, coordinating the massive effort to bring electricity to farms that had never had it. From 1941 through 1951, the American Red Cross used the building rent-free as Evelyn's contribution to the war effort. Red Cross women manufactured surgical dressings there in rooms that had once hosted Belgian royalty. They set up classes to train nurses' aides who would work in military hospitals. They rolled bandages for soldiers in the ballroom where Carrie Walsh had entertained Supreme Court justices. The building that had been built to display wealth was now serving the public good. Evelyn found satisfaction in that transformation, even if she couldn't live there herself. That same year, 1932, the year her mother died, and her divorce from Ned became final, the Bonus Army marched on Washington. 17,000 veterans from World War I, many of them unemployed and desperate during the Depression, came to demand immediate payment of service bonuses Congress had promised, but scheduled for 1945. They camped in makeshift shelters made of cardboard and scrap wood near the Capitol, living in conditions worse than the trenches they had fought in. Congress refused to pay them early. President Herbert Hoover ordered General Douglas MacArthur to clear them out with troops, cavalry, tanks, and tear gas. Evelyn fed them instead. She bought them cigarettes by the carton because cigarettes were currency in camps where men had nothing. She provided a circus tent to house some of them, so they wouldn't have to sleep in the rain. She sent trucks full of food. Her generosity was real, even as her personal fortune dwindled from maintaining friendship and supporting causes she believed in. The newspapers covered her charity work extensively. She didn't care whether they did or not. She did it because it was right and because she had more than she needed while these men had less than they deserved. She continued throwing lavish parties at friendship, despite mounting financial pressures that her accountants warned her about constantly. During World War II, she hosted wounded soldiers at her Georgetown home at 3308R Street. Young men recovering from injuries received at Normandy or Guadalcanal or North Africa were invited to dinners where Evelyn presided wearing the blue diamond. She let them try it on under the watchful eyes of detectives who never left the room. Young men recovering from battle, many of them missing limbs or bearing terrible scars, would wear for a few minutes one of the most famous jewels in the world. They would look at themselves in mirrors and laugh at the absurdity of a farm boy from Iowa or a factory worker from Pennsylvania wearing something worth millions. Then they would hand it back carefully and return to hospitals where they would spend months learning to walk again or use prosthetic limbs. July 28, 1941, Edward Beale McLean suffered a massive heart attack at Shepherd and Enoch Pratt Hospital while sitting in a chair in the common room. He was 52 years old. He had spent 8 years institutionalized, 8 years away from everything he had once controlled. Evelyn did not attend the funeral, which was small and private and attended mostly by staff from the hospital who had cared for him. 3 months later, on October 9, 1941, just as America was moving toward war after years of pretending it wouldn't come, Evelyn's daughter made an announcement that shocked even Washington society, which thought itself unshockable. Evelyn Washington McLean, who had changed her name from Emily Beale and went by Evie to honor her mother, had married United States Senator Robert Rice Reynolds of North Carolina. Evie was 19 years old. Reynolds was 57. It was his fifth marriage. His previous wives had all been younger women who divorced him after discovering what kind of man he was. Alice Roosevelt Longworth called it the most grotesque union since the Minotaur. Evie called it love and said her mother didn't understand. Less than 5 years later, on September 20th, 1946, with the war over and America trying to figure out what kind of country it wanted to be in peacetime, Evelyn found her daughter's body at Friendship. The estate, where parties had once hosted thousands, was now quiet most of the time. Evelyn had been looking for Evie to ask her about dinner plans. She found her daughter unresponsive in a bedroom. A coroner's inquest determined the cause of death to be an accidental overdose of sleeping pills. Evie was 24 years old when she died. She left behind an infant daughter, Mamie Spears Reynolds, who would grow up to become the first woman to qualify for the Daytona 500 and race against men who didn't think women belonged in cars going 200 miles per hour. Evalyn Walsh McLean had now outlived her husband and 2 of her 4 children. She was 60 years old. She had 1 year remaining, though she didn't know it yet. Then Evelyn lost Friendship. Not to death like her children, not to bankruptcy like her husband, to war. When Ned died in 1941, the estate had passed to his father's trust, not to Evelyn directly. She had lived there for decades but had never owned it outright because the property remained in John R. McLean's trust. In 1942, with America fully committed to World War II and Washington swelling with hundreds of thousands of war workers who had nowhere to live, the trust sold the property to the federal government for war housing. The nation needed housing immediately for workers flooding into Washington to support the war effort. Workers who built ships, workers who manufactured ammunition, workers who processed paperwork that coordinated global war efforts. The government wanted the land for a development that would provide apartments and dormitories for thousands of these workers. The mansion that had hosted presidents and housed exotic animals was demolished. Every structure was razed. The golf course where Harding and Coolidge had played was torn up and turned into building lots. The swimming pool was filled in with concrete. The stables were knocked down. The Italian gardens were destroyed. The 75 acres became McLean Gardens, a residential complex that still exists today. Some garden features survived the demolition. The Georgian-style ballroom remained standing and was preserved as a community centre where residents could gather. Some statuary was saved, but Friendship, as the McLeans had known it, as the place where Washington society had gathered for decades, was gone completely. The parties were memory. The excess was history. The llama was gone. The poodle wearing diamonds was gone. All of it was demolished to make room for apartments for file clerks and secretaries and stenographers who had never been to a party with a president. Evelyn was forced to move. She relocated to 3308 R Street in Georgetown, a house she had purchased earlier as an investment. She took the Friendship sign with her, the actual physical sign that had hung at the estate entrance, and hung it on the Georgetown house. It's still visible today if you walk past the house and look up. She continued entertaining during her final years, though on a drastically reduced scale. Dinners for 20 instead of parties for 2,000. She wore the blue stone constantly. She had worn it for 36 years. She would wear it until the day she died. On April the 26th, 1947, a Saturday, Evalyn Walsh McLean came down with pneumonia. The illness progressed rapidly. An oxygen tent was set up in her Georgetown home, the kind of equipment that looked like something from a science fiction story, all plastic and tubes and machinery. 24 hours later, on April the 27th, she died, insisting on wearing the diamond on her deathbed, because she had never taken it off and wasn't going to start now. At her bedside, when she died, were Reverend Edmund A. Walsh, Vice President of Georgetown University, who administered the last rites of the Roman Catholic Church, Supreme Court Justice Frank Murphy, a family friend who had known the McLeans for decades, was there. So was Thurman Arnold, a prominent lawyer and former Assistant Attorney General, and Eleanor Sissy Patterson, owner of the Washington Times-Herald and one of the most powerful women in journalism. When Evelyn died, her servants panicked. They were unsure how to guard the priceless jewelry collection that included not just the Hope diamond, but also the Star of the East and other pieces worth millions. The servants called Justice Murphy because he was there, and he had authority, and they trusted him. Murphy made a decision. He took the entire jewelry collection and rode around in a taxicab all night through Washington streets while figuring out what to do. When banks opened in the morning, he placed everything in a safety deposit box at a bank whose name was never publicly disclosed. Another account, possibly apocryphal, claims the jewelry was found in a shoebox under Evelyn's bed after everyone had spent hours looking for it in safes and drawers. Both stories might be true. Evelyn was eccentric enough to hide millions in jewelry in a shoebox while also having it properly secured. Evelyn's estate was deeply in debt despite the jewelry collection. The parties had cost money. Friendship had cost money. The generosity had cost money. She had spent her fortune on living rather than preserving it. She was buried in Rock Creek Cemetery in the Walsh family tomb that her father had built. She joined Vincent there, her first son. Evie was placed beside her, her daughter who had died the year before. 3 generations of Walsh tragedy in one tomb. Reverend Edmund Walsh, who was not related to the family despite the shared name, read the funeral service. The estate was distributed to her 7 grandchildren, managed by 4 trustees, until the 5 oldest reached age 25 and could inherit directly. The trustees included Monsignor Fulton J. Sheen, one of the most famous Catholic clergy in America, who would later become a television star, and Reverend Edmund Walsh, who was trusted by the family. Her son-in-law, former Senator Robert Rice Reynolds, was given lifetime use of Friendship as specified in the will. By then, Friendship no longer existed as anything but a residential development. The will specified that if the house was sold, Reynolds would receive the proceeds. There was nothing to sell. The stone remained, locked in a bank vault, waiting for its next owner. 1949 arrived. 2 years after Evelyn's death, a New York jeweler named Harry Winston purchased her entire jewelry collection from the estate. The sale was necessary to settle the debts that had accumulated. Winston paid an undisclosed sum, likely in the millions, for the Hope diamond, the Star of the East, the Star of the South, a 9-carat green diamond, and a 31-carat stone that would become known as the McLean diamond. Harry Winston had built a reputation as the King of Diamonds through decades of buying and selling the world's most famous gems. Winston had been born to Russian immigrant parents who were poor but ambitious. He had started in the gem business at age 15, working in his father's small jewelry shop. Family legend told of young Harry walking into a pawn shop when he was 12 and spotting a green gem in a tray of costume jewelry marked 25 cents. The owner thought it was glass. Harry knew better. He paid 25 cents for the emerald and sold it 2 days later to a jeweler for $800. He understood what gems were worth. He understood what stories were worth. He understood that the Hope diamond's value came not just from its carats, but from its history. Winston toured the collection for 9 years in his Court of Jewels exhibition that travelled to charity balls and promotional events around the world. The stones appeared at events in New York, Paris, London, and a dozen other cities where wealthy people gathered to see what wealthy people had once owned. The collection was shown on the television quiz show The Name's the Same in August 1955, introducing the jewels to millions of Americans who watched on small black and white screens. Winston had the Hope diamond's bottom facet slightly recut to increase its brilliance, the first time anyone had dared to alter it in decades. All the while, Smithsonian mineralogist George Switzer was working to convince Winston to donate the stone to the National Museum. Switzer believed it could serve as the foundation for a national gem collection that would rival anything in Europe. The Smithsonian had geology displays, but nothing that would attract the public. Winston was sympathetic to the idea. He liked to say, "We don't have a king and queen, but we should have our crown jewels." He believed important gems belonged in public collections where everyone could see them, not in private collections where only the wealthy had access. November 8th, 1958. The most famous jewel in the world was placed in a plain manila envelope by Winston's staff. The package was wrapped in brown paper and marked with bright red letters reading "Fragile." Nothing else indicated what was inside. It was sent by registered first-class mail from New York to Washington. The total shipping cost was $145.29. Of that, $2.44 covered postage for the weight. The remaining $142.85 paid for insurance on $1 million in declared value, which was far below the stone's actual value, but the maximum the Postal Service would insure. Winston chose registered mail because he believed it was the safest method for shipping gems, despite everyone telling him he was insane. He had sent precious stones all over the world that way for decades, without losing a single package. There was an added benefit beyond cost. Tampering with registered mail is a federal offense. If the package had been stolen en route, the FBI would have been tasked with finding it under federal jurisdiction. No private security firm, no matter how expensive, could match that level of deterrence or that level of resources. The package travelled down from New York in a railway post office train car, the kind where postal workers sorted mail while trains moved between cities. In Washington, it was taken to the city post office, the building that now houses the National Postal Museum, where postal carrier James G. Todd picked it up during his regular route. Todd was a regular carrier who had no idea what he was carrying when he placed the package in his mail truck and drove it to the National Museum of Natural History on the National Mall. November 10th, 1958. During a formal ceremony attended by press and museum officials, the diamond was officially presented to the Smithsonian Institution. Mrs. Edna Winston attended on behalf of her husband. Harry Winston himself could not be photographed according to the specific terms of his insurance policy, which required him to remain anonymous in public settings. Smithsonian Secretary Leonard Carmichael and curator George Switzer received the package. Carmichael signed the receipt for the registered package, making it official. The Hope diamond became specimen number 217868 in the Smithsonian's collection. The stone became the museum's premier attraction immediately. Visitors who had never cared about geology suddenly wanted to see it. For its first 40 years at the Smithsonian, it lay in a glass-fronted safe as part of the Gems and Jewellery Gallery, visible but not dramatically displayed. In 1974, it was removed from its setting for the first time in decades, so scientists could study it properly. Previous reports had listed it as 44.5 carats based on estimates from the early 20th century, but the verification proved those estimates were wrong. In 1997, when the Hall of Geology, Gems and Minerals was completely renovated with modern display technology, the diamond was moved to a rotating pedestal inside a cylinder made of 3-inch thick bulletproof glass that could withstand significant force. It was placed in its own display room, the Harry Winston room, where it could be viewed from all angles as it rotated slowly. The display was designed to be both protective and dramatic, allowing millions of visitors to see the stone up close while keeping it completely secure. The stone has left the Smithsonian only 4 times since it was donated in 1958. In 1962, it was exhibited for a month at the Louvre in Paris as part of a cultural exchange that also included American paintings. In 1965, it travelled to the Rand Easter Show in Johannesburg, South Africa, where it was seen by hundreds of thousands of visitors who lined up for hours. Twice, it returned to Harry Winston's premises in New York, once in 1984 and once in 1996, for professional cleaning and minor restoration work that couldn't be done at the museum. The insurance valuation today is estimated between $250 million and $350 million, though the stone is essentially priceless because there's no market for it. It attracts millions of visitors every year from around the world. According to Smithsonian curators who have worked with it for decades, the diamond has brought the museum nothing but good luck. It helped the Smithsonian build what is now considered one of the finest gem collections in the world. The curse, if it ever existed, appears to have gone dormant or was satisfied with the deaths it claimed, or simply doesn't work on institutions, only on individuals. But what happened to the estates where Evelyn lived, the palaces built by her father's gold? 2020. Massachusetts Avenue sat vacant from 1932 when her mother died until 1951. Almost 20 years of emptiness while Evelyn lived elsewhere and then died. After serving as government office space for New Deal programs and a Red Cross facility during World War II, the mansion was sold on December 19, 1951. Indonesian Ambassador Ali Sastromijojo purchased the building on behalf of his government for $335,000, less than half the original 1903 construction cost, even without adjusting for inflation. Indonesia spent an additional $75,000 to preserve the mansion and restore its interior decoration, which had deteriorated during years of government use. Elsie de Wolf's interior design work was maintained where possible. Anderson's architecture was preserved exactly as built. The Walsh mansion became Indonesia's home in the United States, its embassy in Washington. It still serves as the Indonesian embassy today, housing diplomats and hosting receptions for Indonesian officials visiting the capital. The 60-room structure remains standing on Embassy Row on Massachusetts Avenue. Visitors can view its eclectic facade from the street, the same facade Thomas Walsh had built to announce his arrival in Washington society. The interior is not open to the public for security reasons, but the building serves its purpose. Diplomats now work in offices where Thomas Walsh once hosted King Albert of Belgium. The ballroom, where Carrie Walsh entertained presidents, now hosts receptions for Indonesian officials and visiting dignitaries. The house built for display of wealth now serves diplomatic function. Friendship was demolished in 1942 and never rebuilt. Not a single structure from the original estate remains except the ballroom. McLean Gardens, the large apartment and condominium complex built on the 75-acre site, houses hundreds of residents today. Families live where Evelyn threw parties for thousands. Children play where a white llama once roamed. The Georgian ballroom survived demolition and was preserved as a community centre where residents can gather for meetings and events. Some garden features remain scattered around the development, fragments of the Italian gardens that cost a fortune, pieces of statuary that once decorated fountains. But the friendship that Evelyn knew, the place where she wore the diamond and hosted presidents and felt like she ruled Washington society, exists only in photographs and in the sign she moved to her Georgetown house, 3308 R Street, where Evelyn spent her final years, still stands as a private residence. The original friendship sign is still visible on the facade if you know where to look. Compared to the estates she lost, the Georgetown house is modest, comfortable, human-scaled, a house rather than a palace. The Campbird mine that created the Walsh fortune and made everything possible operated intermittently until 1990 under various owners. Over 94 years of production, it produced approximately $1.5 billion in gold and other minerals when calculated at 2009 prices. Today, most structures have been removed or environmentally remediated according to modern standards. The lower mill site at Sneffels has some remaining buildings and foundations. Rusted equipment lies scattered. But most of the mine that made everything possible has largely vanished from the landscape. Nature is slowly reclaiming Imogene Basin, erasing evidence that men once blasted holes in mountains and extracted fortune from rock. The diamond survives perfect, unchanged, eternal. The estates are demolished or transformed beyond recognition. The woman who connected them all is long dead, buried in Rock Creek Cemetery beside the children who died before her. It's a paradox worth considering. The most fragile thing, a jewel that could be stolen, lost, shattered by a single blow, endured while everything else fell. The most solid things, buildings made of stone and steel that were engineered to last centuries, fell or changed beyond recognition. Thomas Walsh built monuments in stone. His daughter wore monuments around her neck. The stone monuments are gone or occupied by strangers who never knew the people who built them. The jewelled monument sits behind bulletproof glass in the Harry Winston Room, glowing blue under museum lights, visited by millions of people every year, who will never know what it cost the woman who refused to sell it, despite everyone begging her to. This story isn't really about a curse. Curses are easy explanations for patterns we don't want to examine. This is about what happens when money can buy everything except the things that matter. Thomas Walsh's journey took him from a boxcar in Colorado mining camps to a palace in Washington society. 17 years of failure followed by 6 years of success that changed everything. His daughter's journey took her from that palace through ballrooms where she wore cursed diamonds and scandals that destroyed her husband and funerals where she buried her children until she died in a Georgetown townhouse, technically bankrupt despite owning millions in jewelry. The wealth was extraordinary by any measure. The tragedies were ordinary. Children die in car accidents every day. Marriages fail constantly. Minds break under pressure. Addiction destroys lives regardless of bank balances. Money didn't prevent any of it. Money didn't even slow it down. Money just built larger stages for the tragedy to play out on. Money meant the tragedies were photographed and reported and remembered instead of being private suffering that ended when memories faded. Thomas Walsh told his daughter in 1897, "I've struck it. Rich." The statement was both true and false depending on how you measure wealth. Rich in gold, poor in what endured beyond gold. Evelyn titled her memoir, "Father Struck It Rich," published in 1936, when she could look back on everything that had happened and understand the full irony. Perhaps she understood better than anyone that her father had been right and wrong simultaneously. 3 estates built with gold, 4 children born into privilege, 1 diamond that survived them all. The estates are demolished or sold to foreign governments. 2 children died before their parents could. The diamond sits in a museum teaching geology students about type 2b diamonds and trace amounts of boron creating blue coloration. The Indonesian embassy houses diplomatic functions and processes visas. McLean Gardens provides homes for hundreds of families who have never heard of Evalyn Walsh McLean. Private opulence became public utility. Perhaps that's the only kind of survival that matters in the end. If you want to see what remains of this story, the Hope Diamond is at the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History on the National Mall in Washington. Admission is free. Millions of people visit every year to see it rotate slowly behind glass. 2020. Massachusetts Avenue functions as the Indonesian Embassy. You can view the exterior from the street, but cannot enter without permission. McLean Gardens is a residential development on Wisconsin Avenue where the Friendship Estate once stood. The original mansion is gone completely. The Campbird mine is on private property in the mountains above Ouray, Colorado. Remnants remain at the site, but it's not generally accessible to the public and the roads are dangerous. Evalyn Walsh McLean wore the world's most famous diamond while everything else crumbled around her. The diamond sits in a museum teaching science to children. She sits in a grave next to the children she couldn't save. Her father's mansion houses foreign diplomats conducting business. Her husband's estate became apartments for strangers who work ordinary jobs. The diamond endures because diamonds endure. The buildings serve new purposes because buildings can be repurposed. The woman is memory fading with each generation that forgets. Some things survive and some things don't. Survival is not the same as living, but sometimes survival is all that's left when everything else is gone.